Thanks for coming. It's late in the day, so thanks for taking time out to come and listen. I'm going to talk about the French education sector today. So my name is Barclay. I'm based in the consumer and creative team in Paris, and I cover lots of different sectors, including things like furniture, toys, leisure, and education. And I've been working on education proactively for about 3 years. And I do that with my colleagues from social policy and science and innovation at the embassy, and talking also with the British Council in France to try and keep things joined up. The objectives today are to give you an update and an overview of the French education sector. I'm going to focus primarily on primary and secondary and private and state education. I'm not going to talk about higher. And this is going to be quite general because of the range of different things present here at the Education Show. I'm going to look at who you need to be thinking about working with and how to go about it, and highlight some of the areas of opportunities that are out there. So, why France? Well, apart from the fact that they're a neighbouring country, it's quite a big size market. There's 65.8 million inhabitants, and 25.5% of those are under 20 years old. You've got 15.2 million pupils and students, and 6.7 million of those, so over a third, are primary students. The number of students is going up in France. The number of schools is going down, and that's mainly due to the fact that lots of very small schools with 1 or 2 classrooms are actually closing. Education in France has always been a political issue, and it's one of the largest government budgets and one of the few that's not being cut. It represents about 5.9% of GDP, which is slightly lower than the UK, where it's 6.2%. The budget's actually planned to increase. They're increasing it by 6.9% next year. And to give you an idea of how it's sort of split, you can see on the pie chart the blue section. So there's 18.8 billion euros spent on primary education, and on secondary, so the red, the roughly 50 of the 50% that you can see there, 12.2 billion is spent on books and school supplies in secondary education. In terms of organisation, France is very centralised in the state education, and administration is devolved out to local representatives. Private's obviously a lot more autonomous and flexible, which makes it slightly easier. So just to give you an idea of, if you do want to sell direct, how it works, you've got basically 2 pyramidal organisations that work together. You've got the local territorial authorities on the one side, so they are the regions, the departments, the communes, and you can see in that map the coloured blocks are the regions. There's about 27. And then on the other side, you've got the ministry delegates its services out into what are called academies, and there's 30 in France. Not the same amount of regions, because the region of Île-de-France, where Paris is actually split into 3 academies just because of the number of people there. So if, for example, you want to sell to primary school and you want to sell direct to the state system, you would actually be talking about selling to 36,000 different town mayors. So it's quite a high number. But thankfully, there's a trade show that they can go and where they actually go every year to do their shopping, if you like, that has quite a big education section to it. And it's called the Salon des maires et des collectivités locales, SMCL, and that's in Paris every year. I've put 2 links in this slide. They will take you to directories which have lists of schools. So unfortunately, there isn't one list that you can use to mail out to all schools. You have to sort of do it manually. So probably the easiest thing is to have a local intermediary to sell in France. And there are lots of different companies depending on what your product is. I've just put a few. This is by no means extensive, but they're some of the main ones. And I'd just like to highlight a few there for you. So just to talk about some of the key associations, you've got AFINEF, which is up there, top left. They're probably the equivalent to BISA. They are the, they focus, the difference from BISA is that AFINEF only focus on digital resources. And GEDEM, just below that one, is part of AFINEF, but they are a regroupment of software and online resources developers. And the KNE, Kiosque Numérique de l'Éducation, that's a regroupment of some of the main publishers like Hachette, Atier, Didier, and companies like that. So there's some of the main sort of associations. And then to talk about some of the actual distributors and resellers, probably historically, the main one used to be called Camif, is now called Manutan. And they are one of the largest private distributors to the public sector. And they do all sorts of furniture, resources, software for education, as well as for offices and corporate markets. And I put UGAP in there. UGAP's actually, it's not a, UGAP's a public organization. It's the Central Purchasing Organization in France. And their role is to publish tenders that once a local authority wants to buy X amount of furniture, they'll ask UGAP to publish a tender for them. So that's something to bear in mind, is that you do have public procurement potentially in France as a route in. And any purchases of over 15,000 euros by a local authority have to go via public tendering. As I say, this show's quite generalist, so it's quite difficult to make this relevant to each and every one of you. But I can take questions offline if you've got specific questions about distributors, retailers in specific sectors. So some of the needs and opportunities there. Digital is obviously something that everyone's talking about everywhere. And in France, they recently published a digital strategy to bring the schools into the digital era. So that's something they're really, really interested in. To give you an idea, in France, a study in 2011-2012 showed that 32% of teachers were using an interactive whiteboard, and only 5% were doing so every day. So you can see that not all schools are equipped with those, and certainly not all classrooms. So that's something they're interested in. And any content that's granular, so that so a teacher can take a piece of content and incorporate it into their lesson plan, rather than being restricted by something that imposes too long or not all relevant information. Special education needs is increasingly important in the private sector, for private schools, and I have seen tenders in that published recently, so I think that's something that's going to become more and more interesting to them. And then a couple of points on changes. Recently they changed the school week to give children more extracurricular activities on Wednesdays. So anything that that can be used by teachers that's not too expensive, because they haven't got very much budget for this yet, but that they can use to set up activities for kids in schools on a Wednesday that aren't necessarily part of the actual curriculum they'll be interested in. Some considerations for you. France is quite a different, I mean, it's a neighbouring country, but there are some key differences there. And you need to adapt your resource and sometimes yourself for that market. And that can be either adapting the product to the local language or to the local curriculum, or even to the local culture, depending on whether it's content, for example. But also in business, there's some key differences in business culture. So for example, in France, in businesses, well, to speak about education first, because that's why we're here, education is much more formal in France. And the parents, I think, contrary to in the UK, are still kept very separate from the classroom. Although that's starting to change with virtual learning environments and sort of this communication that we're trying to have between parents, pupils and teachers, but it's slow. In business, it's also very formal, and you should always address your contacts by vous and monsieur, madame, obviously until they ask you to use their first names. You should know who's who, and you should try and have business meetings on the same level. And also, I think relationship is very important. And building a relationship is very valued, and it can take time, but it's worth investing in that because it will serve to build a sort of stronger commercial relationship in the long term. So that can involve things like if you're meeting at lunchtime, it's quite normal in France to invite the person you're asking something of. In this case, for example, your distributor, to invite them to lunch and things like that. That's quite normal. So that's very quickly, because we don't have very much time. I would say be perseverant. It's not going to be quick, but it's worth taking the time. And if you've got any, well, yeah, before you ask questions, if you want to find out a bit more information, I would encourage you to keep an eye out for webinars and business opportunities on the UKTI website. We're trying to do more webinars, and if you want to speak to some of the local companies, teachers, get their feedback on your product, here are some, on the slide, some potentially interesting conferences and trade fairs for you. So you've got, for private schools, Le Printemps du Numérique, which is every 2 years. Now, these are conferences, so the teachers are going to listen to seminars, so they will be not on the floor the whole day, but it's useful to get their feedback and also to take the time when they're not there, when they're in their conference, to talk to other exhibitors and find out, you know, how they operate and all of that. It's all about building the relationships, as I said. And then proper trade fairs. Expo Langue, if you're into language learning or study abroad, that's one for you. And Educatech Educatis, which is very tech-based. You can see from all of these, they're quite digital focused, because as I say, that's what they're interested in at the moment. And there's nothing equivalent to the education show in France, but they would normally go to Germany, to Didactic, for that. So you might actually see some French contacts there. And if you're in nursery or early years, AGIM is the conference for you, because that's where all the state nursery teachers go to every 2 years.